Ukraine unbalances Russia. Ukrainian strikes on Russia, May 2026. May demonstrated the transition of Ukrainian strike campaign against the Russian Federation from demonstrative long-range arrivals to systemic pressure on the war supply outline, oil refining, fuel pumping and storage, export ports, military microelectronics, dual-use chemical industry, aviation and naval facilities. The most painful effect lies not in a single specific strike, but in the accumulation of disruptions. Reuters reported that after the May attacks, almost all major refineries in central Russia were forced to halt or reduce production. The capacity of fully or partially shut down plants exceeded 83 million tons per year, which is about a quarter of Russian oil refining, while their share in fuel output accounts for over 30% of gasoline and about 25% of diesel. The bulk of strikes consists of long and medium-range strike UAVs, including Ukrainian systems operating at operational and strategic depths. In the May attack on the Moscow region, the Ukrainian side named the RS-1 Bars, Firepoint FP-1 and Bars SM Gladiator. Maritime uncrewed or strike assets against vessels and port infrastructure were also recorded separately, and on May 5, Zelensky declared the use of Flamingo cruise missiles against a military-industrial facility in Cheboksary. On May 27, the Russian occupation authorities of Sevastopol claimed that Ukraine used Storm Shadow missiles alongside UAVs. Reuters emphasizes that Ukraine did not comment on this specific episode, and the data on military activity has not been independently verified. Let's review the chronology of the main strikes on Russia during the month of May and their results. May 3. Port of Primorsk in Leningrad Oblast. Shadow Fleet tankers, ships. Reuters reported a wave of strikes on Primorsk, a fire in the port, and hits on an oil tanker, a Karakut-class small missile ship, and a patrol boat. Primorsk has capacity to handle up to 1 million barrels of oil per day. On the same day, strike in the area of the entrance to the port of Novorossiysk. NV reported that maritime drones struck 2 vessels of the Russian Shadow Fleet. The logic of the strike is to pressure not only refining but also export logistics. On May 5, VNIRZR progress in Cheboksary. The Kyiv Independent reported a strike of Ukrainian flamingos at a distance of over 1,500 kilometers at an enterprise that produces components for high-precision weapons. Strike on the Kirishi refinery, Kinev, and an oil pumping station in Leningrad Oblast. Ukrainian sources claimed hits on 3 primary processing units and a reservoir. Reuters later wrote that Kirishi was completely shut down starting May 5. May 7. Perm refinery. Reuters reported that the Perm refinery halted refining after a May 7 attack that caused a fire and equipment damage. The plant processed about 12.6 million tons of oil in 2024. May 15. Ryazan refinery. Ukrainian drones struck one of the largest refineries in the Russian Federation. Ukraine reported a major fire, and Reuters subsequently wrote that the plant, which accounts for nearly 5% of Russian refining, halted operations. On the same day, Caspian Flotilla base in Kaspiysk. Reuters, citing the General Staff of Ukraine, reported hits on a small missile ship and a minesweeper at the Caspian Flotilla base. May 16th, Nevinomorsky Azot, Stavropol Krai. A fire was reported following a UAV attack. The enterprise is one of the large chemical producers in the south of Russia and manufactures dual-use products. May 17th, Moscow region, Kopotnya refinery, Angstrem in Zelenograd, Solnogoth station. Ukrainian sources claimed strikes on microelectron production for the military-industrial complex and fuel infrastructure. The Guardian wrote about the use of RS-1 bars, FP-1 Firepoint, and bars SM Gladiator. May 20th, Norsy, Kstovo, Nizhny Novgorod Oblast. Reuters reported that a primary processing unit was hit, causing a fire. Norsy is the fourth largest refinery in the Russian Federation and the second largest in terms of gasoline production.
May 21st. Zizran Refinery, Samara Oblast. Reuters reported a strike by Ukrainian UAVs on the Rosneft refinery. Zelensky called it a long sanction against Russian oil refining, and the commander of the SBS, Robert Brovdy, stated that it was the 11th Russian refinery attacked by Ukraine in May. May 22 to 23rd. Sheskharis/Novorossiysk, Metafrax chemicals in Perm Krai, other military targets. Euronews reported a direct hit on the Sheskharis oil terminal and a strike on Metafrax Chemicals, which supplies products to enterprises associated with aviation, drones, rocket engines, and explosives. May 23rd to 24th. Tarman-Neftegaz Terminal, Ftorovskaya Station, and military logistics. The General Staff of Ukraine reported a strike on the oil loading berth of Tarman-Neftegaz, ammunition, logistics, and fuel facilities, as well as command posts. Tarman-Neftegaz can handle up to 20 million tons of oil and petroleum products per year. May 24th. Ftorovskaya Oil Product Pipeline Management Station, Vladimir Oblast. The SBU claimed a strike on a facility that supplies fuel to large oil depots around Moscow and the Sheremetyevo, Domodedovo, and Venuko airports. A fire covering an area of 800 square miles was reported. May 27th. Taganrog, Voronezh, Tuapse. Separately occupied Sevastopol. The Kiev Post reported strikes on the 325th Aircraft Repair Plant in Taganrog, the area of the Baltimore Air Base in Voronezh, and the Tuapse refinery. Reuters separately reported claims by the Russian side regarding a drone and storm shadow attack on Sevastopol. Such a series of strikes inevitably causes economic consequences for the Russian Federation. The main blow is to the profit margins of the war. Russia earns foreign currency from exporting oil and petroleum products, while domestically it requires a stable supply of gasoline, diesel, aviation kerosene, and fuel oil for the army, industry, and civil economy. Strikes on refineries, pipelines, and storage facilities lead to a reduction of oil output and additional pressure on the federal budget, where oil and gas taxes consist approximately a quarter of revenues. The most painful part is that Ukraine is hitting not only the endpoint refineries, but also the hubs of the system. Primorsk and Taman, export. Kirishi and Perm, refining. Solnogosk and Ftorovskaya stations, pumping and supplying the Moscow hub, Sheskharis and Novorossiysk, the Black Sea direction. This turns isolated fires into a logistical problem. Even if one facility is being repaired, an adjacent pumping station, berth, or reservoir may prevent the chain from quickly returning to normal operations. The strikes also have a moral, psychological, and reputational effect. For Russian society, May expanded the geography of danger. Moscow, Leningrad Oblast, Samara, Nizhny Novgorod, Perm, Stavropol, Chechnya, Krasnodar Krai, Taganrog, and Voronezh. Symbolically, it is important that the strikes took place in areas that Russian propaganda presented as the deep rear, while the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense directly emphasizes the Moscow region is one of the most protected in the Russian Federation, yet strikes on oil, logistical, and microelectronic infrastructure there still became possible. The reputational blow to the Russian state lies in the fact that the Kremlin is increasingly shifting anti-drone protection onto the institutions and businesses themselves. Russia passed a law allowing the central bank, Sberbank, and other financial structures to create their own drone defense systems and arm their personnel. The costs must be borne by the institutions themselves. This looks like an admission. Centralized air defense cannot cover all the critical infrastructure of the country. Thus, Ukraine is systemically scaling up its capabilities for strikes against Russia and focusing on the following directions. Strikes on the fuel cycle at all links: extraction/condensate, refineries, pumping, reservoirs, ports, tankers. This is not a campaign of fires, but an attempt to unbalance the system of fuel supply and currency export. Combining energy with military-industrial targets may include Cheboksary, Ångström, Metafrax, the aircraft repair plant in Taganrog, as well as fleet and aviation bases. This means Ukraine is simultaneously hitting the financing of the war and the production or maintenance of the instruments of war. Creating corridors by exhausting air defense. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense describes medium-range strikes as a link between frontline FPVs and strategic long-range strikes, hitting air defense, radars, warehouses, command posts, and logistics at a depth of 30 to 200 kilometers. Scaling production and procurement. On May 27, the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine announced the Logistics Lockdown Program with an additional 5 billion UAH for medium-range capabilities, explicitly formulating the goal as the systemic destruction of Russian logistics, warehouses, equipment, command posts, and supply routes at operational depth.
With its strikes, Ukraine has shown Moscow's weaknesses and begun to dismantle propaganda myths regarding the omnipotence of Russian air defense, while also highlighting its systemic vulnerabilities. Excessive concentration of value in large hubs. One large refinery or terminal does not just burn, it disrupts the rhythm of refining, exports, military unit supplies, and railway and pipeline schedules. Shortage of dense air defense across the entire territory. Russia is capable of concentrating defense around Moscow, military bases, and specific political centers, but the country is too large and the energy infrastructure is too decentralized. The very fact of legalizing the self-defense of banks and businesses against drones underscores this problem. Vulnerability of repair and restoration. Strikes on primary processing units, pumping stations, berths, and tank farms create a delayed effect rather than instantaneous one. Spare parts, specialists, time for inspections, logistical restructuring, and sometimes the import substitution of components under sanctions. Vulnerability of the shadow fleet and port economy. Strikes on Primorsk, Novorossiysk, Cheskirys, and Taman hit Russia's ability to bypass sanctions through maritime exports and insurance and logistical schemes. The delivered strikes have already created a measurable production effect. Halting or reduction of operations at major refineries, restrictions on gasoline exports until the end of July, and fires at key gas, refining, and transport facilities. As of late May 2026, a total nationwide fuel collapse is not yet visible in the Russian Federation, but there are already 3 signs of a real fuel crisis.
halting or reduction of production at major refineries. Reuters writes that almost all major refineries in central Russia were forced to halt or reduce fuel output after Ukrainian strikes. The affected capacities account for more than 30% of Russian gasoline and about 25% of diesel. Shortages at independent gas stations. Medusa, citing Novaya Gazeta Europe, reported that independent gas station chains, which provide about 40% of fuel sales in the RF, were already unable to normally replenish gasoline stocks in May. Managers of independent chains stated that there was no fuel at all. Manual state management of the market. The Russian government began to control the production, domestic supply, export, and exchange sales of gasoline and diesel more tightly. This means that the market is no longer balancing itself. The most problematic position is gasoline, especially AI-95. According to reports from the Russian market, the AI-95 shortage is worsening due to unscheduled refinery repairs, reductions in primary refining, and a seasonal increase in consumption. Refineries are forced to shift production towards the socially more important AI-92. The second tier of the problem is diesel. Russia traditionally produces more than it consumes, but in May signals appeared that even diesel is becoming sensitive. Medusa's sources reported that at large fuel hubs, as of May 20, supply was available only upon order, not only for gasoline, but also for diesel. The third position is aviation fuel. On May 27, Ukrainska Pravda, citing Bloomberg and Interfax, reported that RF is considering restrictions on export of diesel and aviation fuel due to a sharp drop in domestic production following Ukrainian attacks. The most striking example is occupied Sevastopol. On May 22-23, a sharp deterioration in gasoline availability, queues at gas stations, sales restrictions up to 20 liters per car or canister, and the distribution of diesel by coupons. Formally, the occupation authorities explained this as logistical difficulties. In the RF itself, the manifestations are currently more market-driven than publicly acknowledged. Independent gas stations cannot purchase fuel, and large vertically integrated oil companies are redirecting products to their own chains and not to the exchange or independent retail. This creates a shortage not necessarily at all gas stations at once, but primarily in the independent segment. Even where fuel is still available, the market is already showing a deficit through prices. According to data cited by Medusa, the wholesale price of AI-92 gasoline at the end of May was 25 to 27% higher than in mid-February. Retail prices are rising more slowly because large companies are trying to restrain them through subsidies and state control. It is necessary to understand that a shortage initially manifests not as empty gas stations everywhere, but as the disappearance of free wholesale resources, rising exchange prices, manual distribution, and sales restrictions in problematic regions. As of May 2026, Ukrainian strikes on Russian refineries have begun to transform from a reputational and infrastructural problem for the Kremlin into real fuel tension on the domestic market of the RF. The shortage does not yet take the form of a total nationwide collapse, but it is already manifesting in three areas: the disappearance of free wholesale resources for independent gas stations, rising wholesale prices for gasoline, and the introduction of administrative restrictions from export bans to sales limits in certain regions. The gasoline segment, independent retail and logistically isolated territories, including occupied Crimea and Sevastopol, have become the most vulnerable. For the RF, this is painful not only economically, but also politically. Fuel is a commodity of daily perception. While a shortage of electronics or components for the military-industrial complex is unnoticeable to the average Russian, queues at gas stations, sales limits, diesel coupons, and rising prices immediately strike at the everyday perception of stability. The May strikes have already created a systemic rather than localized fuel tension. The most dangerous scenario for the RF is if strikes on refineries, oil depots, pumping stations, and port logistics maintain regularity in June-July, when seasonal demand for fuel is traditionally higher. Then the current shortage at independent gas stations could transition into a broader regional problem. Ukraine's chosen strategy is working, and its effects are already visible. Continuing systemic strikes on the oil and fuel infrastructure of the RF without allowing it to recover, Ukraine will be able to bring it to a fuel shortage and significant negative social and economic consequences over the summer. Furthermore, the increase in oil value on global markets allowed Russia to partially compensate for its war expenses and reduce its budget deficit. In this case, port infrastructure through which Russian oil is exported remains a legitimate target for Ukraine. A halt in export and the inability to refine oil could lead to a collapse of the oil industry and a blow to the federal budget. Russian oil exports rely on a few port hubs with a very high concentration of volumes. Primorsk, over 1 million barrels per day. Ust-Luga, about 700,000 barrels per day. Novorossiysk or Cheskirys, up to 700 to 760,000 barrels per day. And Kosmino, up to nearly 1 million barrels of SPO coal. It is precisely these ports that are the bottlenecks of the Russian oil economy. Damage to berths, reservoirs, pumping stations, or vessels does not necessarily stop all export, but it sharply complicates the redirection of flows, increases logistical costs, and creates a reputational risk for buyers, insurers, and the shadow fleet. That is why strikes on Primorsk, Ust-Luga, Cheskirys, Taman, or pumping stations have an effect greater than just a fire in the port. They hit the RF's capability to convert oil into currency, bypass sanctions, and maintain the supply of petroleum products. As practice has shown, Ukraine has already found Russia's weaknesses and has begun to systemically act upon them. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to the channel. Stay on the side of good. Glory to Ukraine.